Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm Amy McCreath, and I'm the Director of Contextual Education here at the Episcopal Divinity School, and I'm very thankful that all of you are here this morning for this important panel discussion. I don't think I need to say a lot about why this is an important topic, right? Those of you who are here have self-selected. This is not amplifying my voice. I'm speaking into it for those of you who aren't in the room. Welcome to all of you as well. So if you're in the back and you can't hear me or any of the speakers, raise a hand so that we know to speak more loudly. All right? So this morning we have the great privilege, the great blessing of gathering some wisdom for the important pastoral work that all of us are about in all sorts of different contexts, whether we're in parishes or campus ministries, whether we are in social service organizations or seminary communities or families. We're part of systems where mental health is part of the mix and part of what people hold when they enter into community. And so sorting out how best to be an effective pastor and sorting out what we can do and what we can't do, what the limits of our capacity are, and how best to refer people to appropriate services is really important work. And the longer I am in pastoral ministry, the more important I understand it to be. So this morning, we are so fortunate that we have Jeff Mello and Barbara Callahan and Susan Chorley here to offer their deep wisdom and their good questions to us. This is a huge topic, right? And I've asked each of them to speak for 12 minutes. So this is the tip of the iceberg, but my hope is that all of us will walk out with a little bit more wisdom and some good questions and be incentivized to continue our learning and given some resources for continuing the conversation. So I'm going to be introducing each of them in turn. They'll speak, and then we'll have a little bit of time for conversation at tables between the speakers. And then after the three presentations, we'll have time for questions from you for the speakers as well. All right? And as we're continuing our work, please feel free to get more food and beverages. Thank you to Ashley, who set all that up. Yay, Ashley. And thank you also to Ashley, who always remembers that our learning is not just about what ideas we put in our head, but what we do with our bodies and how we engage our emotions. And so we have chocolate. And we have some Play-Doh, and that's part of your experience this morning too. Feel free to engage fully with chocolate and Play-Doh in two different hands. All right. So this morning we're going to begin with Barbara Callahan. Barbara serves as the second minister at Hancock UCC Church in Lexington, and she's also a licensed psychotherapist. And she has years of experience in campus ministry, and she also started and ran a counseling practice for 10 years. And Barbara spoke to the Alewife Deanery clergy about a year ago and was such a gift to the clergy in our deanery. Several of them are here today because they want to hear more from Barbara, and we're really thankful that she's going to offer the first presentation.
Thank you, Amy. It's so good to be with all of you this morning, and I'm going to be psyched out that this is actually amplifying my voice. So let me know if you cannot hear me. Can you hear me at this level? Okay, great. Well, like Amy said, I've had a sort of variety of experiences. One other just experience I had was that I spent 3 years working as a counselor with a children's hospice in North Carolina. So that's just another piece of kind of a difficult but important niche. If you ever want to talk to me about that, we can touch on that as well. I think you have a handout in front of you. It looks like it's blue, and we can just sort of begin to tick away at some of the things on the handout. I think I want to start by saying one of the most important things when you think about mental health issues and whatever your ministry context may be is to ask yourself the question on a pretty regular basis, kind of, what is my role? What is my job? In my language, I would probably say, in my old profession of counseling, who is my client and what is my job? And as I've transitioned into ordained ministry, I've had to rephrase that question, and the question now sits in the context of the congregation. If I ask myself, who is my client? Well, it's really the whole congregation, right? And what is my job? It's to shepherd and foster the spiritual health and the awareness and the awakeness of an entire group of people. So how then does one person, let's say, sort of fit into that larger picture is a really important question. And now I'm on.
I know. I was like, wow.
Okay, thank you. That's much better. So one of the things to think about always are issues of boundaries. And certainly in ministry, those are issues that are constantly coming up, and they're very different in ministry than they are in a mental health profession. In a mental health profession, they're very clear. Your relationship exists in that office, and that is it. In the church, for example, your relationship kind of exists everywhere. And yet people are coming to you and talking to you about things that are highly confidential often and sensitive and difficult. And then they might see you up in the pulpit preaching, and that's a whole different kind of relationship. They'll run into you in a coffee shop in the community. They'll be in your small group or go on a retreat with you, or they're up until 11 o'clock at night playing games with you. This is a very different context than just the mental health office. So it's important, I think, to establish some limits around what you're doing with folks with pastoral care. And one of those is to remember that your primary job typically is not to be a mental health professional. So it's good to have folks you can refer to for mental health professional things. Your job is often to help folks get there and to be the spiritual support in that process. So for example, my own rule of thumb is I will see someone or a couple or a family 3 times typically for the same thing. And a lot of times it will take the first time of them coming to me just to sort of break down the barriers of admitting that they are really struggling with something. And I work in Lexington, Massachusetts, which sees itself as a very accomplished place. And it's very difficult for people to admit that they have a need. Very, very difficult. That's very hard for my folks. So for them to enter my office and to admit that is like huge. It's absolutely huge. And so to hold the space for them is really important. And then to be able to get to a place where they can find more substantial and long-term help outside of the office, where I can then just be a place that they can come to for other things as well. I'll check in with them regularly, especially if they're connected to a therapist. I'll email or call or send a card and just say, thinking of you, would love to know how it's going, praying for you. Remember, I'm here if you need anything. So folks will do that. They'll come back and we'll just have some prayer time together, or they'll fill me in about how things are going. But the primary responsibility is not resting on me. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's real important to know what your limits are with that. It's good to reach out in whatever community you're serving and find folks who you trust, who you can refer to, and also find folks who you trust, who you can consult with. Now, I have on here an issue of violating confidentiality. It's important to be clear with your folks what your limits are with that. You're not bound by confidentiality in the same way, say, as a licensed mental health professional. And yet it's really important, of course, that you keep confidentiality, even with your partner or your spouse, or you even have to sort of be careful with your colleagues about some of that as well. So, for example, people will come and see me about something, and I don't immediately go and talk to the senior minister about it. I only talk to him if it's germane and really important in a way, and I usually let the person know that it feels important that I let my boss and my colleague know what's going on so we can better care for them. However, it is important if you suspect abuse of any kind, let's say abuse of a child or abuse of an elder, Massachusetts, you ordained clergy are mandated reporters. So that's just something to know. That's different. I'm from North Carolina, and in North Carolina, ordained clergy are not mandated reporters, but here they are. So I don't know if you know that, but that's an important thing for you to know. It doesn't mean you have to confirm abuse or know for sure that's going on. You simply have to suspect it enough to feel like this is going to keep me up at night. I need to do something with this information. And so you call the Children's Protective Services. What is it called here again?
Department of Children and Families.
Yeah. Okay, DCF, right? You call DCF. And that's not a really fun process at all, and I hope you never ever have to do it, but you need to know that you are required to do it if you have this information. Another area of where you need to break confidentiality, if someone tells you that they are planning on harming themselves or someone else, you need to take steps to deal with that. I'm sorry to put these scary scenarios right out there up front, but it is important that you know that. And that usually involves if they're not willing to let you help them get help or go to the emergency room or go to the police. Let's say that they tell you this and they turn and they run out of your office. You don't know where they are. Well, and if it's imminent, you probably need to call the police. And then you need to find your way to the magistrate's office in your community. And directions for doing that are on the second or on the back side of this. So you can look at that later. This, again, is super rare. It likely will happen at some point in your career, but I would guess maybe one time, maybe 2 times. But those 1 or 2 times are important. And once you're there can be someone that can help you know what steps to take. But it's the question with confidentiality will come down to, can you go to sleep at night? You know? It's a tough thing to figure that out. Are there other folks that need to know what's going on, or are you holding the burden all on your own? And if it feels really gray to you, then I would consult. I would call a mental health professional and just say, hey, I need to run this by you. Does that make sense? We'll have some conversation about time for questions later. Okay. Let's talk about just some typical things that are likely to pop up in your context, whatever that context is. And these are not things that oftentimes will require law enforcement. Sorry to start off on such a scary note. But these are just pretty common average things. One would be depression, right? Probably most everyone you know, and certainly including myself, probably including you, has had periods of times where we're blue, right? Where it's tough, where we're a little down. Well, that can range from being sort of down and blue in a situational kind of way to major depression that can be pretty debilitating, and anywhere along that scale. So you're going to certainly see this from time to time. It's important to be able to recognize it. If someone in your congregation or your context suddenly just stops taking care of themselves, say, that suddenly they're coming into church, they're still showing up, but they're just not dressing the way they used to dress. You can tell they haven't taken a shower in a while. You're worried about how they're eating. Just something is off. It's good to be aware of that and begin to wonder if they're in a place of depression, if something's going on. If they're coming to you with sort of excessive guilt, let's say, or a sense of hopelessness, I've certainly seen an uptake in that recently, a degree of hopelessness that's just bigger than it's been in the past. And, well, that's also definitely a sign of depression. If they're not able to get to their job suddenly, also very much a sign of depression. If they're not sleeping or not able to stop sleeping, also probably have some depression going on. So looking at what's going on with them, and then also it can be really powerful coming from someone like yourself to say, I gotta tell you, I'm wondering if you're struggling with some depression. Seems like you might be depressed. To have that come out of your mouth can be really validating for what they're experiencing. Again, in my context currently, if someone's struggling with depression, they feel typically a huge amount of guilt that they're not able to function at the level they were. And they don't know why, and they just generally feel incredibly inadequate which in a high-powered kind of place is a huge deal. And it can help to go, I think you're struggling with something bigger than you right now. Let's see if we can get you some help. Anxiety, another very common struggle with mental health, again, can range from I'm worried about some things to I'm paralyzed with worry and anxiety about some things. And then there's also obsessive compulsive disorder in that, which we sort of jokingly at times call OCD, and there's lots of sort of hints of that in our culture, but that's also on the anxiety scale, just so you know. Again, most people at some point will probably have some generalized anxiety, if not specific anxiety, and just helping folks recognize that's what's going on. That's one of the biggest things that you can do in helping them to get connected to a larger support system. Bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is in a category all of itself within the larger degree of mood disorders. There is a lesser bipolar disorder and then a more severe. And this used to be called manic depression back in the day. And yes, okay. So I think that changed maybe 20, 15 years ago. So characterized by times of mania, which would be just lots and lots of energy, people staying up sometimes for days on end, like cleaning their house or making really irresponsible purchases or whatever it may be, to then swinging to times of major depression, a depression that's much more deep than just major depression. Without treatment, there's a high degree of suicide that often goes along with bipolar disorder. So important to recognize that and help folks get help as soon as possible. And there's a whole issue of personality disorders that is, I'll just say this, if you're dealing with someone in your congregation and you continually feel a little crazy in your own dealings with them, and I'm not saying that you're not crazy, that could certainly be, I could be crazy too. It's good to check that out. But chances are you're dealing with someone with a personality disorder, which is, it's a characterological disorder that is so ingrained into someone that they just see it as part of themselves and they don't see it as a disorder at all. For example, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, there's a whole slew of them. You can look up information online pretty easily. But you'll hear folks say, well, this is just the way that I am. And folks just need to get used to it. But the way that they are is causing significant damage to themselves and to everyone around them, and most certainly to your congregation. So it's really helpful to see that for what it is and to address it. A couple things to think about. My time is running out here. Is considering creating care circles within your context, especially a church is really a good place to do this. We have typically in churches, congregational care teams that are really great at bringing food to folks after babies are born or after surgeries or in the midst of bereavement. But a lot of times we will not do the same for folks struggling with mental illness. So what would it look like to have sort of a group of folks within your context that are willing to be educated on these things and willing to be the support for those folks? People maybe in and out of hospitals or treatment centers, and what if we treated them the same way and we helped them with food, or we helped them with rides or transportation or getting to various appointments, and just let them know that we were available for practical things as well as available to listen, and to put it into the congregation in a way like that takes it also off of your own shoulders. That would be an incredibly caring thing to do. Okay. Again, remembering that you're probably in your context, if it's at all similar to mine, your larger sort of focus and job is the health of the whole system, not just one person. So let's say you have someone in your context who is just simply not willing to get help. They're not willing to get treatment. They don't think they have any problem. They really want everyone else in the whole system to change the way they are with them so they will feel better. If something like that is continuing and continuing and continuing, it's incumbent upon you typically to take steps to help limit how much damage they can do. So there is a place, I think, for saying we need you to not be in leadership. You know, we need you to, you can only be in leadership if you get some help in regards to these things. And if there continues to be unwillingness, it is sometimes the greater good to ask them to be somewhere else. That's a really hard thing to do, and that's a really extreme thing to do. But if you talk to ministers who've had a long tenure, they're likely to tell you that at some point they've had to do that. There's more information on your sheet, and I'm sorry I've run out of time, but I believe it's time for questions. Or no, we'll do that at the end. Conversation. Okay.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
Yeah.
So Barbara's offered us a great overview of the landscape, right, and the kind of main, Barbara has offered us a great overview of the landscape in various systems and sort of the key practices that leaders need to be about. And now we're going to invite you to take about 8 minutes at your table to just share with one another what you heard that really resonated for you or challenged you, right? This is hard work. So what's the challenge to you personally, the holy challenge? All right, so take a few minutes if you haven't introduced yourself to one another, just to say who you are and where you're from and what did you hear?
Man, that time goes really fast.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and it's so much.
Yeah.
All right. So I am going to invite us back into plenary, and we'll continue on with our second speaker. So Jeffrey Mello is the rector of St. Paul's Church in Brookline, and he is an alum of the Episcopal Divinity School. Yay! Jeff is also a licensed social worker, and he worked for years at Mass General Hospital with oncology patients, with addiction issues, and with psychiatric services. And today he's going to share out of his wisdom and build on some of the things that Barbara said. So, Jeff.
Thank you. How do you hold all that in your head? How do you know that? That's incredible to me. That's true. Good morning. And first I want to say congratulations for making it into this room. Because, no, honestly, this is one of those things where I think a lot of us go through our lives saying, the less I know, the better, because I'm afraid of what I'm going to find out if I actually start. And probably what many of us will leave this morning with is feeling overwhelmed and understanding how much we don't know. And if that's the only thing that happens, that's great, honestly. Because I think one of the most important tools for me in ordained ministry is remembering what I don't know and who I'm not, right? To build on the topic of boundaries, really keeping in mind who I am in this moment. And with this person. Now, having the only correction to my introduction I'll make is that I'm actually not a licensed clinical social worker, because I intentionally let my license lap so that I was more clear in ordained ministry of who I was and who I wasn't. And I didn't want anybody thinking they were coming and getting free therapy from their clergy person, which is often something that I am enticed into because I love it so much. And I'm convinced that with 12 50-minute sessions, we could really figure this all out. So I just share that I am not immune to that lure. I also want to suggest that this is not an us-them conversation. Everybody in this room has mental health as much as we have physical health and spiritual health. So some of the things, sometimes what we do in parish ministry is we look out at our congregation, we try to figure out who has mental health issues and who doesn't, and everybody does. And sometimes people have a cold, and sometimes they get a terminal diagnosis. And it's the same with mental health. Sometimes people are feeling a little blue, and sometimes they're at risk for taking their own life. But it's not that any of us go through life without mental health, hopefully, right? Because that would be a problem. And we all struggle. And I think that that's one of the things that I love about my role as clergy that I wasn't able to do as a clinician is talk about what that means in the spiritual context in which I practice, which is about restoration to community, right? I mean, what Jesus did was restore people to wholeness and to community. So I think in mental health, that's my call, is to say, yeah, we're going to talk about the fact that this can be scary and that there's shame, and that we ask you not to talk about this in public. And we're going to walk through this together and figure out what wholeness and what healing looks like, which is a whole nother topic about being careful about what we're saying and what we're not saying. I also want to say that, the talk about mandated reporting, it can be a scary one, and it can also be really liberating, because I hope for all of you that you remember that you are not the last person to have to deal with whatever's coming in your door. You're probably the first, but you're certainly not the last. And there's a whole group of people out there waiting to help. And that sometimes our job is not knowing how to help, it's knowing who to call to figure out how to help. And so I want to encourage you to figure out if you can have the answer to the question, who's on the other end of your bat phone, right? Do you have a bat phone that you can pick up and you can say, this is what just walked into my office door, can you give me any guidance? And that's probably not anybody in the structures of like DCF or any of the sort of official, but like who's a trusted colleague? who's another person in the world whose opinion you trust. So again, really just having some humility about this work, and understanding that you don't have to know all the answers, just hopefully who to call who might have some guidance and wisdom. I want to start by sharing a case statement that really brings this home, and I share this with permission, but I'm also going to change the name. So Susan was a member of our congregation and was one of those Insta parishioners who everybody wants to clone. About 3 months after she joined the congregation, she was leading just about any ministry we would let her lead. She was spirited, she was joy-filled, she drew people to her. She walked in the door with her spouse, and their 3 children, right? It's like, you know, clergy see the average Sunday attendance figures rolling, and it was all great. It was all great. Now, I knew some information about her and her family coming in. She had been referred to my congregation because of an incident that had happened at the previous congregation that required a separation between her and her previous clergy person. So I knew some stuff going in. And over the years that Susan and her family were at the congregation, she would go through these periods where she would take on everything, and I knew and watched Susan's bipolar disorder get increasingly more difficult for her and her family to manage. The congregation had no clue. What they saw was this really joyful, spirited, full of energy person who sometimes wouldn't follow through on tasks, but it was okay because she was on to the next one. Near the when things got really complicated and there were several hospitalizations, I started getting a lot of questions. You know, it was time to come up with the next vestry slate. And why wouldn't I put Susan's name forward for vestry? And what did I have against her? And couldn't I see? Now, some of this got articulated to me, and some of this was my own internal dialogue about my fear of what people were thinking. Susan ended up dying at her own hand by hanging herself in the 3rd floor closet of her home while her son and his best friend were playing downstairs. And it sent incredible shockwaves. What we didn't say at the beginning is that this topic, because we are not other to it, if there's stuff that we're talking about today that's bringing up stuff for you, I hope that you'll take your own mini mental health break and go for a walk outside and get connected with something that feels peaceful. I probably should have said that when I started. It was really hard for the community. People were shocked, and Susan and her family made the decision that they wanted to talk about it. So I preached about her mental health struggle at the funeral, and we've been talking about it ever since, and it's been an incredible learning for the congregation. But I share that story with you because sometimes we are left holding information that is super difficult. And we want to be able to say, if the other folks only knew, then they'd understand. And sometimes I like to tell my congregation, you know, if you all had thought bubbles above your head that I could freeze, and then you all could do a gallery walk and look at everybody else's thought bubble, you would realize you are not alone. You are not the only person in this congregation struggling the way that you are struggling. But we don't talk about it, and we don't know how to talk about it. So I guess that's my main thrust for what I want to start with today is sort of how are we in our roles agents of restoration to wholeness, and what does that look like, and how do we reduce shame? How do we talk about it? And if you're wondering, how do I talk about this, or what do I do? Sometimes it's actually really helpful to ask yourself, what would I do if this were a physical illness? If somebody came into my office and said, Jeff, I have an open abscess on my leg, and I don't know what to do with it, I would probably say, go see a doctor, right? Because I don't know what to do, and it's getting worse. Why wouldn't I do the same thing if it were a mental health issue, right? So sometimes just sort of taking it out of the realm of scary, unknown shame and bringing it out into the light and say, this is a part of all of our lives, and it's what it means to be a whole person. The other thing I'll say about that, which got me thinking, is sometimes I say, we're the church. These are our people, right? Oftentimes, the folks who are struggling in a world that doesn't make sense to them, or for whom they don't make sense to the world, they find their way to us because there is some hope that things will make sense and this will be a community that can hold them. And so sometimes, it's like, well, we are, after all, a hospital for sinners, right? Yes, we are not a museum for saints. And I say, yes, absolutely. But even a hospital will separate someone who is at risk for contaging the rest of the unit, right? And nobody judges that. So again, it's like, it's okay. You don't have to be perfect here. And we have a larger group to take care of. And right now, we need to just sort of take care of you. And that means maybe not being in a leadership role, or looking more carefully at how this behavior, which is not you, its behavior, is impacting the larger whole. I think that's where how am I doing for time? Because I could keep talking. I got 2 minutes. Let me just see if there's anything that I didn't. Just on mandated reporting in Massachusetts, it's children, elderly, and those who are disabled. So that, again, in the mental health area. So if anybody has a disability and is at risk of being hurt or emotionally or financially abused, that's also part of mandated reporting. I talked about the bat phone. You talked about the 3 and out, which is a really good model. Sort of, have we talked about this 3 times? And if it's more than 3 times, chances are it's time to find somebody who can do this work with you in an ongoing way. Oh, I didn't talk at all about substance abuse, which could be a whole day, whole semester conversation, but to think really carefully about the role of substance use, the role of your own substance use, because as clergy, we are at risk because we hold a lot of this stuff and we don't know where to go with it. But also, what message does your community send about the role of substance use in it? So wine and I went to a church once to do an intervention after the clergy person had been removed for substance use. They were selling crystal meth out of the rectory, and well, that's a real thing, right? I mean, how desperate and broken are you to lose any sense that there's something problematic with that, right? I mean, that's a devastating story. So I went to this congregation at the invitation of the bishops, and just to talk about sort of what happened and what they might want to do going forward. And the senior warden called me and said, "We're looking forward to having you on Sunday." I thought, probably not, but okay. And they said, "We're thinking of doing it in this room." That's great. And it's our practice at these types of events to serve sherry. Would you like there to be sherry? Right? No, I think it'd be best if we didn't have sherry at this particular event. And then the wheels started to tick for this community, right? Yeah, thank you.
I want to invite you again to take some time at your tables to share with one another what of all the wisdom that Jeff has offered, what rises for you as particularly important? What questions does it raise for you about your own practice and what it means to offer healthy leadership? And we'll take another 8 minutes for that. All right. We're going to continue on. So I invite you to wrap up your conversations. So now we're going to hear from Susan Chorley. Susan is an ordained American Baptist minister, and she serves as the Associate Director and Minister for Programs for the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry Center. And she's also on the board of an organization called Exhale, which works with those who've made the difficult choice for abortion to help them tell their stories and listen well to one another and find empowerment and support through that work together. And so Susan, over to you.
Thank you. Whoa, thank you. I just wanted to also acknowledge what Jeff and Barbara both said is so much of this work is intersected with our lives. And I'm really speaking today about my own experience both of domestic violence and abortion and how that intersects with my life as a minister, my life in congregations, and thinking together with congregations about how to be supportive to people who are experiencing domestic violence or who are making a choice around reproductive loss or not, or having to make a decision around reproductive loss, and how do we have these hard conversations within congregations. And I think so much of this comes from growing up in a congregation where I really felt like it was okay to talk about everything, where I really felt like it was okay to ask a lot of questions, where I really felt like it was okay for me to have struggles and to bring that into the life of the congregation, into my youth group, into my worship, into any way that we did social justice in the community. All of those things raised me up in the American Baptist denomination, feeling like this was an okay thing. The interesting part about it was that when I became an adult and started moving in various different circles within my denomination and within congregations of different denominations, I realized that all those things that I was raised to believe were good and just and right often weren't accepted. And that was a real sort of call to faith for myself, and has really propelled me forward in the work that I'm doing. And I feel blessed and privileged to be able to be in a Unitarian Universalist context where we still wrestle with these conversations, and the conversations are okay to be having. So I realized that I was in an abusive relationship when I was pastoring a congregation in the North Shore of Massachusetts. I had no idea that I had been experiencing abuse for 8 years. It was not physical abuse. It was emotional and mental abuse. It was tracking me, not allowing me to have connection with family or friends, criticizing my ability to be a parent, sort of nothing ever working right. And I just thought it was a hard relationship. It took me realizing that I needed to resign from the congregation where I was working, and God does wondrous things, and placed me working as the director of a domestic violence shelter in the city. And starting to read all this information because I needed to get up and ready and going around domestic violence, and seeing my story in the pages of the books that I was reading. And realizing that I needed to leave, and realizing that I needed to figure out how my son's father was going to have a relationship with his son, and realizing that I had no idea how I was going to make this all happen, and really, in many ways, realizing that I couldn't have done this in the context of a congregation. And though I totally acknowledge and agree that being a pastoral leader and going through a domestic violence situation doesn't work. I also think the silence and the shame and the lack of recognition about what was happening was incredibly painful to me. And I felt as though I had failed, and that was how everyone was viewing me, from my parents to my congregation that I grew up in to the congregation where I was serving. So I just think that in congregations, thinking about how we think and talk about relationships and how we think and talk about when things get hard and when things are abusive. I think that there is a real difference. I was told that relationships are hard, that you're gonna experience challenges, that you have to compromise, that sometimes you have to give up. And I believed all those things. And I think all those things are true. And when you're in a relationship where someone is controlling everything that you do, it doesn't matter how many times you compromise or change things or give up on things, nothing's ever going to be right. And so I think giving a chance, having as a pastor, as a pastoral leader, whether it's from the pulpit or in education hours or in ways, and even in youth group, a lot of congregations that we work with are like, oh, well, we don't want to talk about this with the children. And I do think that children are brilliant. Children can see when things are happening that aren't good. Children know when their parents are hurting. And you don't have to go into a ton of detail about domestic violence or intimate partner violence to give children some information about what's okay and what's not okay in a relationship. So there's lots of creative ways for us to do this together. And when I think about my own child, when he was 3 years old, when I decided that I needed to leave, and when I went to go pick him up at the daycare and I said, we're leaving, I didn't have to say anything else. He went and cleared everything out of his cubby. He said goodbye to all of his friends, and we left. And he knew that day was gonna, he didn't know before, but he knew that day when I arrived that something had changed and that we were leaving. And so I think for me, I follow him and his lead so many times in this whole experience. And I think that, I think children are brilliant and can see a lot of things that we don't think that they can. Or that we don't want them to. So I think naming domestic violence, naming abuse, talking about how this doesn't just happen. Oftentimes in our UU context, people talk about how domestic violence happens in the inner city and it doesn't happen anywhere else. That's false. And or not recognizing that it happens in gay, lesbian, transgender, queer communities. There is intimate partner violence, unfortunately, in all relationships. And we need to think about, I think in congregations, the magic of a congregation is that, yes, there is the moment where you might need to say to someone, you need to step back, you need to get help. And yet, a congregation can have the opportunity to minister to the child, minister to the person who is experiencing the abuse, and minister to the person who is abusing. In my mind, congregations are the best setup to be able to do this. And in fact, the congregation that I had just joined when I moved to the city, right when I realized that this was all happening, the pastor there was able to set up with a group of people in the congregation safe places for my son to have visits with his dad during the time that we were not seeing each other. And to have a network of people that didn't need to know a lot of information, that loved me, that loved my ex-partner, and loved our son, and to be able to open up their homes so that they could see one another once a week made a huge impact on my understanding of what community can look like, and how people can move into love and support you when you're going through hell. I think that's a huge, that's what, to me, that's what Christian community is about. So that's what I'll say about domestic. I work, our organization has a domestic violence shelter in Mission Hill. And I would just say that we're one of the only domestic violence shelters. Well, we are the only state-funded domestic violence shelter that offers support around spirituality and faith. And I'll just say that that's the only group that everyone that lives in our shelter actually wants to go to, is the one that offers space for people to talk about how this intersects with their faith and with their understanding of God, if they believe in God, or their understanding of sort of what's right or just in the world, and to be able to share that in the context of the shelter with other staff, as well as with volunteers, as well as with clergy, is incredibly powerful. And I think that so much of what we often forget to ask people is what has propelled you forward, what is helping you through this. And so many of the people in our shelter say that their faith has really led them to deciding to leave the relationship, to investing in themselves, to investing in their children, and to trying to figure out how to move forward. So the second piece that I wanted to talk about is around abortion. So talking about all the fun topics today. So about a year ago, Parents Magazine reached out to this organization that I am on the board of called Exhale, and they were interested in featuring a story about mothers who had had abortions, because that is oftentimes not the people that we think about when we think about people who experience abortion. And so Exhale reached out to me and asked if I was willing to be featured in that story. So there was a story that was put online for Parents Magazine over the summer. I think it was in June. It was right before, I don't know what the Supreme Court case number was, but the one that was coming up around Roe v. Wade. And so it was sort of to raise visibility around sort of this different set of women who have experienced abortion. So as a part of that experience, I, along with Exhale, have developed what we're calling a pro-voice sermon tour. And so I'm traveling across the country to different Protestant congregations and preaching about my own experience of abortion as a mother, as a minister, and as a woman. And it's been an interesting process. And I would just say that most congregations, you've never heard the word abortion from the pulpit. Most congregations, you've never heard abortion anywhere. And it's been very fascinating for me to reach out to clergy, many of whom I am friends with, and talk about that I would like to come and have this opportunity to preach in their congregation. And my sermon is not about abortion rights at all. That's not what this is about. It's about the fact that women that are sitting in the pews of your congregation, and maybe women who are leading in your congregation, have experienced abortion, and we're not talking about it. And it can be seen, it can be experienced as a huge loss in our lives. And again, if you think about little Susan growing up in a congregation, I thought that when I had an abortion, I thought that that would be something, but when this happened to me, I felt as though this should be something I should be able to go to my congregation with. Not as a clergy person again, but as a person of faith needing to walk through something that was incredibly painful to me. That to me was, the Christ experience. That's what, to me, this was about. And I felt like not only did my parents want to slam the door on me, but many congregations did as well, and they continue to. And I think that I don't think we need to talk about, what's wonderful about Exhale is that we're not talking about being pro-choice or pro-life. We're talking about being pro-voice. These are women's stories. Women's stories need to be heard. I preached at First Baptist Church in Salt Lake City the Sunday after the election, and 2 women who I would say were in their 80s came up to me afterwards in tears, saying that they had never told anyone, but that they had illegal abortions when they were in their 20s. 2 women individually, not together, and I just think, I didn't even imagine that would actually be something that would come out of this pro-voice tour. But it's really been an awakening, I think, for myself and for congregations, and I'm excited about, what I love about theology and about ministry is moving into like a very gray, complicated, complex area, right? That's what we're supposed to be able to do. I know we often don't, but that's what we're supposed to be able to do. And we all have tons of feelings about abortion. All of us do, because there's, sort of the constant fighting that we're hearing about it. We all have tons of feelings about domestic violence. All of us do. And again, there's sort of, I wouldn't say there's the same dichotomy around domestic violence, but there's the same sort of level of shame that can be over that. So I think that thinking about how do you even just raise the conversation around reproductive loss in your congregations, and thinking about is it even possible to name abortion as a reproductive loss? And if you do, how do you do that? And how do you prepare for the conversations that it will take after you talk about that? And I think the other piece that I've learned through my work with Exhale has been that not everyone's experience, no one's experience of abortion is the same. And their feelings are not the same about it. Many people on our board don't like that I'm using the words shame or wanting healing. They don't like that because for them, everyone who has an abortion feels fine and it's good. And that's not totally true. That's not what they're saying to me. But I'm just saying there is this sort of notion in the pro-choice world that it's not a conversation around life and death. Because if we say that it's a conversation around life and death, somehow the pro-life side wins. I think it is a conversation about life and death, and that's okay. And we need to wrestle with that. And I think that raising visibility around this conversation and bringing more women together to be able to tell their unique stories around their experience of reproductive loss is incredibly transformational. So I would just say lastly that I think the presidential election was incredibly traumatic. It was traumatic to women. It was traumatic to immigrants. It was traumatic for Muslims, for Jewish folks, for folks who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer, and for people of color in general. And it was traumatic for everyone. And I was just talking with my mom recently about, she has struggled with depression throughout the context of her life, and she said she's experiencing depression and anxiety now like she's never experienced it before. And she didn't understand why. And I said to her that I really felt like that was happening in general across our country after the presidential election. And she's also in North Carolina. So there's even more of a heightened feeling of depression and anxiety there. And I just think that naming that, sort of normalizing that for all of us is incredibly helpful and a gift that you can offer to your congregation, that you're experiencing it too. And I think sort of providing spaces for people to come together and talk about how we're managing that. I think, and maybe affinity groups for different types of people to come together and talk about how we're managing that, and how we need to get on board, because we're going to have to fight really hard, and it's going to be fun, and it's going to be a lot of work. And we can't stay stagnant, we can't stay victimized, we can't stay back. So yeah, I just was thinking about that. And I think I would just close with saying, one of the things I've wrestled with around this Pro-Voice tour and around telling my personal story around domestic violence and abortion is, who am I to be sharing this story? Shouldn't this be someone else, And I think that for some reason, I've been given this opportunity. And for some reason, you all have been given the opportunity that you have to be bold, to stand up, to minister, to bring people together. And that positive sense of what you have been given, whether it's out of your brokenness or out of your great joy, is a gift. And I'm proud to be in this with you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yeah. So, so much to take in and to ponder and share. We're going to take another 6 minutes, 7 minutes for a final chance for you to talk with people at your table about what rises up for you in terms of the challenge of this hard work where body and mind come together and spirit, and helping people to find a place that is safe to talk about all of this. So some conversation at tables, and then the rest of our time will be for questions for the panelists. So be thinking about what you'd like to ask as well. All right, we've come to the part of our morning together where we invite your questions for the panelists. Because we are recording this and because people are watching this live in other locales, we'll ask that you use the microphone to ask your question so that we can be sure to record the question as well. All right? So I'll come around with the microphone and let us know who you are, and if there's a particular panelist you'd like to hear from, let them know that. Otherwise, we'll just let them decide who's going to answer the question.
Hi, my name is Carrie Jo Verhulst. I serve at University Lutheran Church in Harvard Square and as Lutheran chaplain to MIT. This was all immensely helpful, and I'm going to ask a question that none of you particularly addressed. It's the question of, particularly the congregation I serve, not infrequently, and this has happened at MIT with the student ministry as well, when people come in off the street, whose home is the street, who are very clearly and evidently living with tragically serious mental illness that is untreated. And you're pastoring a community that really wants to be completely open and loving and embracing of all. And then there's disruptive, we had a great conversation around like how much disruption can you tolerate, how much can the community absorb, and when do you need to sort of isolate the person, redirect them. I always come to these things, I was saying at the table, one, a 5-plan that I'm going to be the savior, that I'm going to be the one who like graciously and lovingly, redirects the woman whose voices are telling her to curse us out, which is my own ego. But maybe I'm just looking for resources or trainings, because some of this stuff is like all the stuff we're talking about now about being an upstander when somebody is being harassed. The civil rights movement didn't happen by people thinking about it. They practiced. I mean, do any of you know any places to sort of practice this kind of grounded, strong, compassionate, containing and redirection that sometimes sadly really needs to happen?
So I would just say I feel like that there are some ministries with the homeless that are happening, I thought, through the Episcopal. Am I wrong? Mm-hmm. Okay. No, I'm not wrong?
You're not wrong.
Okay. So I don't know if Jeff can speak to that, but one thought sort of going off of what Jeff said was, in the congregation I was a part of in San Francisco, we had a group of people that were sort of a care circle around mental health issues and homelessness. And as people came in to our congregation, oftentimes in the middle of the worship, these individuals were the people that responded. I mean, that moved and sat closer to them, engaged with them, welcomed them. Sometimes offered, and we would never have it be one individual. It was usually a team of 2 or 3 that would engage with the person, and oftentimes ultimately welcome them to come and get something to eat, and bring, if they were being distracting to the point of the service, welcome. And it wasn't always 100% successful. However, I think, you as the pastoral leader, when you're sort of on with worship, can't be the one that's sort of addressing this, but giving training to people around how to respond, and how to be close, and how to be welcoming at the same time of being firm. And there were situations where we had to call the police, where we couldn't, we had tried everything that we could try, and we had to do that. And I have different feelings about that now than I did then. But there were, there were situations that were beyond our ability to handle, and we didn't want anyone to get hurt, including the person that was causing the disturbance or the harm.
The only thing I would add to that is being clear, again, what the goal is. And if somebody's walking around with fixed delusions. The object isn't to convince them otherwise, it's to listen. I think so often in our work, when we really abide and do some really hard listening, that's all folks want. So if somebody's in and they're sort of wound up, to invite them, even it's called rolling with resistance, right? Rather than pushing back, just sort of use the energy that's coming at you and saying, oh my gosh, you sound really upset. Why don't you come in and tell me everything that you have to say? And I want to hear when you can, like, you know, and safety, theirs and yours, right? So in some sort of public space. Absolutely. Gosh, how hard that must be. Sounds like the church has really hurt you. Sounds like you have a lot of questions about what's going on here. Tell me more. Where are you coming from? And then you can sort of de-escalate when that's one option. The other is, have you ever had anybody faint during a service? So again, practicing that same tool, right? It's a physical reaction that we know how to respond to. So if somebody comes in off the street and they're disruptive to service, what if they came in and fainted, right? You might have some people who are more trained to respond. You might invite the rest of the congregation, let's sing a hymn.
Yep.
I'm gonna go talk with this person. Let's sing that Stand By hymn we have. This isn't scary, this isn't horrible, they're not wrong. They just need some extra help right now, and that's why we're here, right? And then afterwards, what do you do after somebody faints? That we pray, or we say the EMTs came, they're on their way to the hospital, sounds like everything's going to be okay, they probably just didn't, sounds like they didn't eat this morning, right? We might say they got some help, they're much more, they seem okay, and we can continue with the service now. So again, you've got the individual and you've got the larger congregation, and you're wanting to take care of both at the same time. And then sometimes when it happens and you move through it, the congregation can feel like, oh my gosh, we are a place that can hold that. And if we can hold that, then I'm actually going to talk about this not so scary thing that I have going on, right?
I would just add, be aware of your own safety.
Yeah.
Don't go it alone. I mean, grab someone else in the church, the custodian or someone else, to be with you.
And I hope that everybody's office doors have windows in them.
Yes, okay. Hi, thank you so much. My name is Citraka, and I'm from HGS across the street. My name is Citraka, third year MDiv at HGS across the street. So very, very thankful for this opportunity. So my main question has to do with parents and parenting. Can you talk about what you've talked about, but for parents, and especially maybe bring it to the election outcome, and how parents might be a front line of renewal, restoration, wholeness, and resistance, and what ministers can do to actually talk, because I think parents are very powerful, but also very powerless when it comes to all of this. So can you talk about what the good news is for parents and the call in these days?
Yes, please, somebody tell me what the good news is for parents.
I think we're all parents, right?
Yeah.
We're all parents.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say that the morning after the election, several of my friends texted me and said, "What do I say to my kids?" And I just reminded them how much you love them, how much you want to listen to them, and how hard all of this is, and acknowledging all of that. I think that a lot of my friends felt like they had bashed a particular presidential candidate to a certain point, that their children, hated this person, and sort of felt like there's no way, we're all gonna die, and so now how do I try to make some sense of this, and I don't, I'm not blaming anyone for doing that. I'm just saying that I think that was what was running for people. But I do think, I have found, I have a 14-year-old, and I know it could be different at different ages, obviously, but I think the biggest gift I've been able to give to him is listening to him. Listening to him talk about young people at his school who are scared about being targeted because of being people of color, being queer, being immigrants, and his own sense of, this is his sense as a 14-year-old, I'm a white straight guy, I'm all set. And what does it mean for everybody else around me that doesn't feel that way? But where's the pain in that for him? Like I'm okay and everybody else is, like he feels responsible, I think. So I think like listening to him there, and similar to what I needed as a child but didn't necessarily get, is that he can't, none of us can fix everything. We live in a broken world. And the thing I said after in my sermon that luckily came to me right before I was to preach the Sunday after the election was that the Ecclesiastes scripture that's around, there's nothing new under the sun. We've been here before. People of faith have definitely been here before. And let's remember that. And let's live into that. This isn't new. It might be new for some of us with some privilege. But it's not new for most others of our brothers and sisters.
Yeah. So at my church, I have to give credit to our very, very gifted children's minister, but he created the Sunday after the election just these cards for every kid to take home that were simply affirming their beautiful worth in the eyes of God and the eyes of all of us, and here's where you can come if you can give us a call or reach out in various ways if you need anything. So everybody left, and then a bunch of adults took them too, with these little cards. But also he created a pamphlet about what does it mean to be an ally in general across the board, like, very kid-friendly language. What does bullying look like, and what to do if you're feeling that, or how to step in and how to ask for help. And again, we're here, and made sure all the parents had that too. And so I think just affirming their own ability, first of all, their own worth and their own ability to also stand up as well as so my daughter is only 9 months old, so there's not much conversation. But definitely my wife and I have just a reaffirmed sense of commitment around part of what we instill in our children, of course, is we have to do our best to leave the world better than we found it when we left. That's it. So also I will say, just as a gay woman, I was the birth mother of our child, and we had already lined up just to sort of cover bases for my wife to officially adopt our child. And we did that just on the offhand chance that the election might not go the way we wanted, just to cover bases. And our appointment with the judge was the morning after the election. It just happened to be that morning, the first thing. And I would say for parents, especially parents who don't necessarily have automatically assumed all the parental rights, it's also really helpful to help them think through some options for them legally for queer families.
My question is also about parents. I have a number of parents of adult children with mental illness in my congregation. In some cases, I have a relationship with the children. In some cases, I don't. I have a lot of experience with working with people with mental illness. I'm at a loss in dealing with the parents because I see a lot of not acknowledging the severity of the situation or not understanding the depth of the challenge. So one specific circumstance I've had is an adult child calling me in crisis. I feel like that went well. She doesn't come to church regularly, but then 2 weeks later she had to be hospitalized. She had made me agree. She had asked that I agree not to tell her parents. She's an adult. So I'm having angst over my role with parents of adult children who do not see the depth of the challenge of the mental health.
Parents, I'll speak for myself as a parent, I either underestimate or overestimate my child's trouble. I very rarely get it right. until after he tells me that I got it wrong. And I'm often reminded that my role as a parent is to love him and support him and not take his pain away, but to let him know that when pain happens, I'm there, and that my love is unconditional. And sometimes that gets in the way. And I think that dealing with parents around what's going on in their kids' life is complicated. But it's almost like when you're thinking about who's the client, you've got two different clients. And the goal is not always to have them be in the same place, or if that's your goal, good luck with that. Your goal is to say, what does each person need? There's if you want to do more reading about behavior change, and you look up stages of change, that's been really helpful for me along almost any change: institutional change, community change, personal change, my own change. Because without getting into too much detail, there's different stages of readiness for change. And if somebody's at what's called pre-contemplation around change, which means they don't see the problem, and I come at them with resources, lots of nods, right? We've all done that. Let me give you the list of resources for this problem you don't know you have, right? So just like with children, with their parents, is to listen. And the task with pre-contemplation is to educate and to wonder with them. Do some good godly play with the parents, right? I wonder what it's like for you that your child was hospitalized. What does that mean? How are you feeling about going forward? Oh, it's fine, it's going to be great. Oh, what tells you that? Because maybe they have resources I don't know, and maybe I'm more scared because I'm afraid someday my son will be hospitalized. But this parent's got it figured out, right?
This is very common, what you're referring to, and I often see parents, especially of adult children, who it's like they're the frog in the pot that's slowly been heating, right? And so it's hard to realize how much their lives have been overtaken by their adult child. So certainly NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, huge resource in trying to connect them with various NAMI support groups, which are really, really good and important. Education around that they're not crazy, they're feeling crazy. And again, trying to help connect them to mental health professionals, but being the spiritual support that helps them give themselves permission to not always be, completely self-sacrificial. Help to give themselves permission to realize what is a loving boundary, I would say.
We get a lot of folks that call our hotline, our domestic violence hotline, that are parents. And want to know what's the best way for me to intervene in a relationship that's abusive. And, there's not a best way. But I do think that parents feel very responsible and blame themselves a lot for what's happening. And I think naming that as a parent can be helpful. I mean, it's complicated because I do think it's not that it's their fault that something like this has happened, but I do think that sometimes family systems are really broken, and mental health and abuse and other things come out of that. But you did the best that you could with everything that was going on in your life, and so many of the parents that call just. They want to be given something to do, but I was just talking with a parent last night who, just can't believe that this is happening, and I think just sitting with them in that space of you can't believe that your young person is hospitalized again or overdosed again or in another abusive relationship. I think it is unbelievable, and the world is that hurt, and sometimes we direct that hurt on ourselves.
The only thing I want to add also is not being prescriptive about what reactions should be. in any situation, right? So like somebody dies, there's a world of difference between you must be so sad and I wonder how you're feeling. Because if they've been in a long time abusive relationship, this might be the saving grace from God that they've been waiting for a long time. And by being prescriptive about their reaction, you're telling them that they don't have a right to feel that. Wellness and health is not always easy, right? If you think about somebody who gets into recovery, it asks the whole system to change. And it's not always welcome news, because all of a sudden the light gets turned on somebody else when the identified problem is rectified. So if somebody's had a long-term illness and they get well, even asking to the partner or the parent, I wonder what this is going to be like for you now that so-and-so is well. Because it might be, who am I? What role do I have? I've spent my whole life taking care of this person. I don't know what to do. So just being really practicing not being prescriptive about how folks are feeling. Even about the election.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Do we have one more question? And I'm going to preference students. That's all right. Last call. Students? All right, then we'll go to Sarah.
I just have something that I brought up at our table that someone said, maybe you should say that, and just to get a response from you all, and that is about what I see as a parallel between, I guess, the cycle of domestic abuse and I think what we're experiencing in our country, and how we're left paralyzed, or we can feel left paralyzed, and particularly, I think as people working in parishes, okay, we open space, and yes, we try to push people to act on their convictions moving forward, but how we really are left we feel paralyzed in many ways. Any comments y'all have about that?
I agree. When that whole, when the release of the video and the audio around Donald Trump's conversation with whoever, I don't care, happened, and the sort of, the Facebook phenomenon of sort of everyone saying things about it, it was personally hard for me because my ex-husband talked to me like that. That's how my ex-husband talked to me. And then everybody going all nuts about, no, men talk like this. This isn't a thing. We don't talk like this in whatever, locker rooms. Great. And this is what I was raised in. I was raised in listening to boys talk to me and other women like this. And I was supposed to think it was funny and okay. And I married someone who continued that, and so it just, so yes, I felt completely, I felt in a certain way like completely invisible, and in another way completely traumatized. And I needed help getting off of Facebook and not engaging in fights with other men who I am friends with about sort of my experience. And I needed help sort of reconnecting with other people who are also survivors, and to be able to talk about kind of what this experience was like for them. I would also just say that, the morning after the election, one of the children in the shelter came out of the room and into the staff office and said, do we need to pack or no? And her mom is only Spanish speaking, and the staff that was on was only English speaking. So we don't know sort of what happened between mom and child. I mean, we did later, but in the moment we didn't know. But the fear and trauma that is running and continues to run is real. And this, 4-year-old girl being unsure what needed to happen next is incredibly painful. And I think that finding ways for us to raise voice to these stories and see our way through them and see our power from them is where we need to be pushed and led. And I think there needs to be time to also sit in the pain. We can't stay there forever. It's not going to be good for us to stay there forever. But I think that it's not the end of the story. And we need spaces where we can name and own our own power.
So I would also add, I think, yes, there's parallels with intimate partner violence cycles. I also think there's strong parallels with the stages of grief. And that I think holding the space for the trauma and the shock and the numbness and the all of it, the hopelessness, the sort of all of it, very important. Along with finding ways of giving hope and inspiration, not that are at all surfacey, but are very much tied to a sense of call for this time and place. So I think the church has an incredible opportunity right now to really take back what does it mean to be the church. What does it mean to be the progressive social voice of love and faith and hope? I just think it's really important that we not give up hope, and not again in sort of a Pollyanna way, but in a very real way of saying we've been here before, and this is our time. This is our time to lead through this and out of this.
Can I say something quick? I know we're at 12, but it was before the election, our congregation did an adult ed series called Bridging the Political Divide, which was a Church Next program by Parker Palmer. And one of the best parts of that was when he said, sometimes I just don't know what to say. And I had an experience of being at a gas station run by a family from a predominantly Muslim community that I've been very vocal in my support of, and they'd been targeted. And I was getting my car fixed there, and the brother of the owner came out and said, I'm sorry it's taking so long to fix your car. You know the Mexicans, they are so slow. And my son is Latino. He's was born in Guatemala. And I was like, uh-huh. And I got my car, and I had no response. So anyway, Parker Palmer gave me a sentence to say in that moment, because you're trying to figure out safety, right? It's like when I've been called faggot. It's like, where am I? How can I respond? So I think the church has a real opportunity to give tools to help move people out of that feeling paralyzed. You have a voice. You have something to say. So we actually took turns going around in a circle and practicing this one sentence that goes something like, what you just said bothers me, and I choose to live in a world where we don't talk to one another like that. And it was completely, and we went around and we practiced it, and people wrote it down and they put it on index cards. And I feel like, should that happen, I don't have to think anymore. Yeah. What should I say? I know what to say. So that kind of real practical ways of stepping out of that immobility and saying, here's a tool, let's practice this together where it is safe. First, it has to be safe.
What's the name of that series?
Bridging the Political Divide by Church Next. If you haven't found Church Next, it's great. Parker Palmer.
Thank you. This has been such a gift. Thank you so much to Susan and Barbara and Jeff. Let's give them a round of applause. And thank you also to Ashley Anderson and to Ian, who's been doing the tech work. There he is. And to the Lilly Foundation, who's offering funding for all of this. So yay for the Lilly Foundation. So Ashley, if you didn't register before you arrived this morning, and you give Ashley your email address, she will include you. She's going to send out a follow-up email with some more resources to support some of the things that have come up this morning. Also, we have sandwiches for everyone. So have a sandwich. You can stay here and eat it together and continue the conversation, or take it with you on your way. And just a final note, there's one more panel discussion that we're planning in this series on faithful leadership, and that will be in April. And that is about taking the visions framework for anti-oppression work in communities that's taught here at EDS, taking that framework into parishes and faith communities. So bridging the gap between learning it in an academic environment and bringing it into real community. And so watch for that on the EDS website. So thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah.